and welcome. Even as nearly 50% of our fellow citizens have embraced a white supremacist running for president, it is clear that the scandal of racial oppression in America continues to roil the society, and with ferocity. This set of facts concentrates the mind on the breathtaking, enduring relevance of James Baldwin's prophetic percipience, which percipience is everywhere in evidence in the essay that will be performed tonight, The White Problem. And by the way, this was Jimmy's way of setting straight a matter that used to be referred to by the media as the Negro problem. The performance tonight is informed by a collaboration between two exceptional artists who also happen to be beautiful human beings. Reggie D is a New York-based multidisciplinary art-ivist who most recently appeared in Matthew Lopez's two-part epic, The Inheritance, on Broadway. Other acting credits include appearances at New York Theater Workshop, the Public Theater, 59E59, Arden Theater, Berkeley Rep, and La Jolla Playhouse. As a director, his work has been featured at the Public Theater, Atlantic Acting School, New York Winterfest, Bay Area Children's Theater, Berkeley Playhouse, Alta Theater Ensemble, and more. He's currently co-writing a play and is the co-host of the comedy podcast, What's the Tea? Raelle Myrick-Hodges has worked as a stage director for over 25 years. She is the founder of Azuka Theater in Philadelphia. As a practicing theater artist, Raelle has directed plays in genres ranging from classical work to interdisciplinary ensembles and presentations. Her regional work has been seen at Playmaker Repertory, the National Black Theater, the Public Theater, Magic Theater, California Shakespeare, and Cal Arts, Red Cap. She has worked with artists such as Jeffrey Arend, Yassine Bey, Marian Hyman, J. Alphonse Nicholson, and Jeffrey Wright. Raelle directed tonight's performance and appears on screen as Baldwin's confidant, Nina Simone. We also have a treat for you, a special appearance tonight by dancer and choreographer Hussein Simko. Now, I'd be remiss not to give a shout out to the book in which The White Problem appears, a book that I had the honor of publishing called The Cross of Redemption, Uncollected Writings, edited by Randall Keenan, a spectacular writer himself who wrote A Visitation of the Spirits and Let the Dead Bury Their Dead, a collection of stories. Randall passed away recently, and I dedicate this performance to him. The White Problem.
I should say two things before I begin. One, I beg of you to hold somewhere in the center of your mind that this is a centennial year we're celebrating. 100 years of Negro freedom. Two, I am speaking in the context of the Birmingham crisis, and in this attempt to speak to you, I'm going to have to play this entirely, as they say, by ear. I want you to reconsider or really listen to the last two lines of an extremely celebrated song as though you were an actor under the necessity to deliver Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be, etc., as though these words had never been heard before. Now, these last two lines could be extremely corny, but I beg of you to take them seriously. They're a question. Now, these last two lines, I want you to pretend you are being asked to deliver on some stage, somewhere, as though these words had never before been heard, are these. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? And now please try to make a certain leap with me. I have one more quotation I want to give you. This one comes from Nietzsche. It's been on my mind all week. At some point, the man says, I stand before my highest mountain, before my longest journey, and therefore must I descend deeper than I have ever before descended. There are several thousand things one must attempt to suggest due to the context in which we're speaking. In the life of a woman and in the life of a man, in anyone's life, there are always many elements at work. The crucial element I wish to discuss with you is the element of life which we consider to be an identity, the way in which one puts oneself together, what one imagines oneself to be. For example, the invented reality standing before you today, known arbitrarily as Jimmy Baldwin. Now, this invented reality contains a great number of elements, many of them extremely difficult, if not impossible, to name. This invented reality has struck a kind of bargain with the world. He has a name, we know what he does, and we think, therefore, we know who he is. But it's not that simple. The truth, forever, for everyone, is that one is a stranger to oneself, and one must spend day in and day out with this stranger, that one is, in fact, forced to create as distinct from invent oneself. Life demands a certain kind of humility. The kind of humility to be able to make the kind of descent Nietzsche is talking about. Life does not offer one as many choices as one would like to believe. In my life, and in your life too, I'm sure, when you were young, one supposes that there is a way to avoid disaster. Let me try to spell that out for you a little bit. When I was a little boy, for example, I used to tell my mom, I'm going to go there, I'm going to do this, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to do this. And my mom would just look at me and say, it's more than a notion. It took me a long time, very, very long time, to begin to realize that she was right and to begin to realize what she meant. I, like all of us, thought that I knew what I wanted. I thought I knew who I was, and like all of us, I thought that whatever it is I wanted and wherever I wanted to go, I could achieve without having to pay my dues. For one thing that one cannot imagine when one is young is how to pay your dues. You don't even know if there are dues to be paid. Now, later on, one begins to discover, and with great pain and very much against one's will, that whatever you want, whatever it is, at the bottom must be to become oneself. There is nothing else to want. Now, whatever one's journey is, one's got to accept the fact that disaster is one of the conditions under which you will make it. The journey, I mean, not make it in the American sense. And you will have to learn a certain kind of humility, because the terms that you've invented, what you think define and describe you, will inevitably collide with the facts of life. And when that collision occurs, and make no mistake, it is an absolutely inevitable collision. When that collision occurs, like two trains meeting head-on in a tunnel, life presents you a choice. It's a very narrow choice, the choice of holding on to your definition of your life, yourself, or doing as the old folks used to say, and as anybody who really wants to live has to say, yes, Lord. Which is to say yes to life. can do that, you've not become a man or a woman. Now, in this country, this inability to say yes to life is part of our dilemma, which could become a tragic one. It's part of the dilemma of what is being known as an American. Now, the collective effort until this moment and the collective delusion until this moment has been precisely my delusion when I was a little boy. The delusion that you think you can get what you want and become what you want and go where you're saying you want to go painlessly. Furthermore, if one begins to examine for a second, or if one really tries to define the proper noun American, one will discover that the noun equates with a catalog of virtues and with something called, plaintively enough, I am an American Day. Now, to be an American means, I gather, check this out, go with me, that though Greeks, Armenians, Turks, Englishmen, Scots, Italians may be corrupt, sexual, unpredictable, lazy, a little lower than the angels, Americans are not. Quite overlooking the fact, quite simply, that this country was settled by Englishmen, Scots, Turks, Armenians, etc. Every nation under heaven is here, and not, after all, for a very long time. I think it might be useful in order to survive our present crisis to do what any individual does or is forced to do to survive his crisis, and that's to look back on his beginnings. In the beginnings of this country, now it might seem a banality to say this, but it still needs to be said, the beginnings have nothing to do whatsoever with the myth we've created about it. This country did not come about because a bunch of people in various parts of Europe said, I want to be free, and promptly built a boat or a raft or whatever and sailed the Atlantic Ocean. No, not at all. In passing, let me also remark that liberty and freedom are grossly misused terms. Liberty is a genuine political possibility, despite the fact that the word is so often misused as a slogan, and freedom, which as far as I know is beyond politics, though affecting it and affected by it, is the last thing most people want. Anyway, the people who settled this country, the people who came here for one reason only, no matter how it was disguised. They came here because they believed it would be better than where they were. That's the only reason. Anybody who was making it in England did not get on the Mayflower. Now, it's important to begin to realize this and recognize this, because part of the dilemma is this country is that it has managed to believe the myth it's created about itself, which is another way of saying it has entirely denied its past. And we all know, I think we do, what happens to a person who's born where I was born, say Harlem, who goes through the world thinking they were born in Sutton Place. And what happens to a person, as odd as it is to say, also happens to a nation. A nation being, when it finally comes into existence, the achievement of the people who make it up. And the quality of that achievement being absolutely at the mercy of and defined and dictated by the nature and the quality of those people. Let me point to, if I may, another thing, which is really the same thing. The Italian immigrant coming from Italy, or for example, or the parents, the son of parents who were born in Sicily, they make a great point of not speaking Italian because they're going to become an American, and he can't stand his parents because they're backwards. Well, this may seem like a trivial matter, but it's of the utmost importance when a father is despised by his son. It's one of the facts of American life, and it's what we're talking about in oblique and very terrible fashion when we talk about this idea of upward mobility. In this extraordinary endeavor to create this country, a great many crimes were committed. And I want to make absolutely clear, or as clear as I can, that I understand that crime is universal, as old as mankind. And I trust, therefore, that no one will assume that I am indicting or accusing. I'm no longer interested in the crime. People treat each other very badly, always have, and very likely always will. What I'm talking about is denying what one does. This is a much more sinister matter. And we did several things in order to conquer this country. There existed at the time that we arrived on its shores a group of people who had never before heard of machines, or as far as I know, of money, which we had heard of. We promptly eliminated them. We killed them. I'm talking about the Indians in case you don't know what I'm talking about. Well, people have done that for centuries. But I'm willing to bet you anything, like most people who were taught American history, you have no real sense of what that collision was like, or what we really did, or how we really achieved the extermination of the Indians, or what that really meant. And it's also very interesting to consider the fact that very few social critics, very few at all, have begun to even analyze the hidden reasons for the popularity of the cowboy Indian myth, a myth so popular that in 1963 it dominates the American television screen. Suspect that the reason for all those cowboy Indian stories is they're designed to reassure us that no crime was committed. We have made a legend out of a massacre. Now, in which connection, if I may digress for a moment, there used to be an old joke going around among Negroes. If you remember the Lone Ranger, he was white, and of course, he had a sidekick called Tonto, an Indian. As always, a good Indian. Well, he rode around with the Lone Ranger, and according to my memory of the story, Tonto and the Lone Ranger ran into this ambush of nothing but Indians, and the Lone Ranger said, "What are we going to do, Tonto?" And Tonto looked at him and said, "What do you mean, we?" Well, I tell that joke in order to point out something else. It's a Negro joke. One of the other things we did in order to conquer this country, physically speaking, was to enslave the Africans. Now, slavery, like murder, is one of the oldest human institutions, so we cannot quarrel about the facts of slavery, which is to say we could, but that's another matter. Now, we enslaved them because in order to conquer this country, we had to have cheap labor, and the man who is now known as the American Negro, who's one of the oldest Americans and the only one who never wanted to be here, did the dirty work. Hoed the cotton. In fact, it's not too much to say that without his presence, without that strong back, the American economy, the American nation would have had a vast amount of trouble creating that capital of which we are now so proud, of which we claim the Negro has done nothing to contribute. In fact, if the Negro had not done all that toting of barges and lifting of bales, America would be a very different country and certainly a much poorer country. But the people who settled this country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't, and I mean you can tell, he wasn't anything but a man. But since they were Christian and since they had already decided they had come here to create a free nation, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in their everyday life was to decide that he was not a man. For if he was not a man, then no crime had been committed. That lie is the basis of our present trouble. It's a very complex lie. For if on the one hand, one man cannot avoid recognizing another man, then it is also true, obviously, that the black man in captivity, being treated like an animal and told he was an animal, knew he was a man being oppressed by another man who did not even have the courage to admit what he was doing. When the African slaved the Africans in Africa, he did not pretend he was merely breaking in oxen. Let me tell you a small anecdote. I was in Dakar, in Senegal, just off Dakar. There's a very small island which was once the property of the Portuguese. It's simply a rock fortress, and from Africa, it's the nearest point to America. I went there with my sister to visit this island and something on the island called the Slave House. The house is not terribly large. It looks like the houses you see in New Orleans. It's the truth. It's got 2 stories and a courtyard and a staircase, and on each side, sweeping stone staircases. And I assumed that the captains and the slavers lived upstairs and the slave quarters were downstairs. Well, you walk through this kind of archway. It's very dark, very low, made of stone, and on either side of you are a series of cells with stone floors and rusted bits of iron still embedded in the walls. Now, this might be my imagination, but it seemed to me that the smell was still there. And I imagined what it must have smelled like, with all those human beings being chained to one another, unable to speak because I remember they had all come from different tribes. So, like I said, in the corridor, there are cells on either side of you, but straight ahead, as you enter the archway or the corridor, there's a much smaller doorway cut out of stone, and that doorway opens out to the sea. And you go out to the edge of the door, and you look down, and at your feet are some black stones and the foam of the Atlantic Ocean bubbling up against you. That day we were there, I tried to imagine. I couldn't. The ocean is simply as vast as the horizon. I tried to imagine what it must have been like to be there, chained and speechless in the most total sense of the word. On my way to where? There were some French tourists there, and I confess that I almost hit one of them in the head. He wouldn't have had any idea why. Anyway, it was the black man's necessity once he got here to accept the cross. He had to survive. He had to manage somehow to outwit his Christian master. And what he was really facing when he got here was the Bible and the gun. But I'm not complaining about that now either. What is most terrible about our American dilemma is that American white men are not prepared to believe my version of the story, to believe that it happened. And in order to avoid believing my version of the story, they have set themselves up in a fantastic system of evasions and denials and justifications, which system is about to destroy their sense of reality, which is another way of saying their moral sense. What I'm really trying to say here is that the crime is not the most important thing. What makes our situation so serious is that we have spent so many generations pretending that it did not happen. Ask yourself, on what assumptions rest the terrible questions which white men ask no matter how politely? On what assumption rests the question, well, would you let your sister marry one? It's based on some preoccupation in white man's imagination. God knows I am not interested in marrying your sister. Really, I'm not. On what assumption rests the terrible question, well, what does the Negro want? That question betrays a flight from reality which is absolutely unimaginable. If we weren't dealing with what in the public mind we call a Negro, that question would never be asked. We'd know damn well what he wanted. We know damn well we would not like to live the way we compel him to live. Anyone who asks, well, what does the Negro want, is saying in another way that he does not wish to be told, is saying in another way he's afraid to change, is saying in another way he's afraid to pay his dues. Let's go back for a minute to where we started. Let's go back to Nietzsche. I stand before my highest mountain, before my longest journey, and therefore must I descend deeper than I have ever before descended. And we spoke a little earlier about the necessity when that collision occurs between your terms and life's terms of saying yes to life. That's the descent. That's the difference between a boy and a man. A boy imagines that there is some way to get through life safely, and a man knows he's got to pay his dues. in this country, the entire nation has always assumed that I would pay his dues for them. That's what it means to be a Negro in this country. It means that you are the receptacle of and the vehicle of all the pain, all the disaster, all the sorrow, which white Americans think they can escape. It's why white people, until today, are still astounded by and offended if, by some miscalculation, they are forced to suspect that you're not really happy with them. It's true, and I'm not just talking about the Deep South. People finally say to you out loud in an attempt to dismiss the social reality, but you're so bitter. Well, I may or may not be bitter, but if I was, I'd have damn good reason to be bitter. Chief among them, the fact that American blindness or American cowardice, which allows you to pretend that life presents no reasons, if not no opportunities, for being bitter. In this country, for a dangerously long time, there have been two levels of experience. One, to put it cruelly, but I think quite truthfully can be summed up in the images of Doris Day and Gary Cooper, two of the most grotesque appeals to innocence the world has ever seen. And the other, the subterranean, the indispensable, the denied, can be summed up in the face and in the tone of Ray Charles. There's never in this country been a meaningful conversation between the two levels of experience. Let me force you, or try to force you, to observe a paradox. The paradox is this. Though almost all white Americans come from Europe, Europe understands the American Negro much better than it will ever understand the white American. White Americans find it extremely difficult to establish any real dialogue between themselves and Europeans for the very good reason, no doubt, that they have yet to break into any communion with themselves. But Black Americans and Europeans know what it means to suffer. Black Americans and Europeans are far beyond any hope of innocence. A bill for the American endeavor to go from the cradle to the grave looking like Eisenhower has now come due. White people are astounded by Birmingham. Black people aren't. White people are endlessly demanding to be reassured that Birmingham is really on Mars. They don't want to believe, still less act on the belief that what is happening in Birmingham, and I mean this, I'm not exaggerating, there are thousands of ways to kill or castrate a man, has been happening all over this country for generations. They don't want to realize that there is not one step, no inch, no distance, morally or actually, between Birmingham and Los Angeles. Now it is entirely possible that we may all go under. But until that happens, I prefer to believe that since a society is made by men, it can be remade by men. The cost of this transformation is high. White people, white Americans will have to ask themselves precisely why they found it necessary to invent the nigger. For the nigger is an American invention. They invented him out of terrible necessities of their own. And every white citizen of this country will have to accept the fact that the dogs and hoses being turned on American children, on American soil, with the tacit complicity of the American Republic, those crimes are being committed in your name. He is no longer innocent. Black people will have a difficult task too, which is to allow white Americans their first awkward steps towards maturity. But we have functioned in that capacity for a great many years already. We were the first therapists here. If we hold on just a little bit longer, I think we may make it. We gotta try. But I have tried to outline what I take to be some of the conditions for our survival.
Let me suffer.